Hey guys, tonight we set sail across the old seas, where maps are more suggestion than certainty, and stories of faraway lands pass from lip to lip like drifting embers. You feel the salt spray of the Mediterranean on your face, the wooden planks of a ship groaning under your feet, and the endless horizon pulling your eyes farther than you thought possible. Beneath the starlit sky, sailors whisper of Africa, lands of gold, creatures unknown, and rivers that vanish into deserts. And if you tried to survive one of these early voyages yourself? With no compass, no fresh water beyond wooden barrels, and food that rots before the month is out, you'd be begging to turn back by the second week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on the quays of ancient Greece, in a port like Corinth or Athens, where ships bob gently against the stone piers. Merchants gather around amphorae filled with oil and wine, but their conversations stray to distant places. Egypt, Cyrenaica, and beyond, lands across the shimmering blue where the known world fades into rumor. You hear mention of Libya, the Greek name for the vast land south of the Mediterranean, a term they use loosely for nearly everything beyond the familiar Nile. To them, Africa is both close and impossibly distant. Close enough that their ships touch its northern edge, distant enough that its interior might as well be another planet. Sailors returning from Egypt tell of journeys up the Nile, where pyramids loom like silent mountains and temples glow with painted walls. They carry not just grain and papyrus, but also stories of Nubian lands farther upriver, of warriors with bows taller than men, of gold dust carried in gourds, of cataracts that roar like thunder. Historians still argue whether Greeks themselves traveled far into Nubia or relied on Egyptian reports. But for you, walking through the agora where traders gossip, the sense of mystery is thick. Africa exists vividly in imagination, if not yet in geography. The Romans take this curiosity and sharpen it into empire. You march on paved Roman roads leading to Carthage, once a rival city, but now absorbed into Rome's dominion. Markets overflow with olive oil, figs, and North African grain that feeds half of Italy. Yet even here, whispers persist of lands beyond the desert, territories of Garamantes and other peoples who drive chariots across sands, trading with sub-Saharan caravans that vanish into horizons of heat. A quirky detail catches your attention. Roman writers describe troglodytes, cave-dwelling peoples supposedly living along the Red Sea. Were they real, exaggerated, or misheard tales of nomads? Historians disagree, but the strangeness of the descriptions shows how thin the line is between fact and imagination. You stand by the docks of Alexandria, where Roman ships unload spices and ivory. Captains claim to have sailed down the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean, hugging the African coast as far as modern-day Somalia. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a sailor's guide written in the 1st century CE, describes ports like Rapta, where tortoiseshell, ivory, and slaves are traded. Yet scholarly uncertainty lingers. Was Rapta near Tanzania, or farther north? The coordinates blur, and your map feels unfinished, its edges marked with guesswork. Still, to the Mediterranean world, Africa is both supplier and enigma. You see coins stamped with elephants, ivory carvings polished smooth, and exotic animals shipped north for gladiatorial shows. Lions, leopards, and even giraffes stumble into Roman arenas, their presence proof that Africa holds marvels too wild for Italy's tame countryside. A curious anecdote surfaces. Emperor Augustus once paraded a rhinoceros in Rome, so strange that crowds gasped as though they'd glimpsed a living myth. Yet even with their reach, Romans never pierce Africa's heart. Caravans travel into the Sahara, perhaps reaching Lake Chad, but written records vanish into sandstorms of uncertainty. Scholars debate whether Roman expeditions truly contacted sub-Saharan kingdoms, or if these were tales passed along by intermediaries. You, watching a caravan's line of camels disappear into a shimmering desert horizon, understand how impossible it was for Europeans of the time to grasp the full scale of Africa. By the twilight of antiquity, you feel the edges of Europe's awareness stretching, thin and tentative, like fingers brushing the surface of an ocean too vast to hold. Africa is present in trade, in myth, in rumor, but always just beyond reach. The first steps have been taken. Glimpses across seas, notes in travelogues, the rumble of ivory unloaded at docks. And yet, the continent remains mostly a silhouette, its heart still hidden, waiting for future centuries when sails, caravels, and courage will bring Europeans farther than ever before. You climb aboard a Phoenician ship, its hull narrow and sharp, its sail a patchwork of linen pulled taut against the wind. The year is centuries before Rome's might, and these seafaring traders from Tyre and Sidon are already pushing outward into seas others fear. You smell pitch and salt, the tang of fish drying on deck, and you hear the creak of ropes straining against wooden pulleys. Beneath the stars, the Phoenicians chart their courses by constellations, whispering names that sound half prayer, half navigation. Their journeys take them not just across the Mediterranean, but along the north coast of Africa, where they establish outposts that will one day blossom into great cities like Carthage. You follow them southward, past the familiar harbors of Egypt, past the green delta of the Nile, and into stretches of coastline less known. They trade glass beads, dyed cloth, and crafted pottery for ivory, gold, and animal skins. Some stories claim that Phoenician sailors, commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh, even circumnavigated the entire continent of Africa around 600 BCE, returning to the Red Sea after 3 years. Historians still argue whether this feat was truly possible with the ships of the time. The detail that the sailors reported the sun rising on their right when sailing west suggests authenticity, yet the evidence remains elusive. You picture it, a line of small ships hugging a vast and terrifying coast, their sails battered, their holds filled with exotic goods, their crew returning home with tales that sound like madness. In Phoenician lore, Africa is a place of wonder and fear. You sit with sailors by a campfire on a rocky beach as they share stories of monsters lurking beyond capes, of seas that boil, of coastlines where no ship dares linger. A quirky note slips in. They describe gigantic birds capable of lifting elephants, a tale likely inspired by sightings of large raptors but stretched into myth. These stories travel back to Mediterranean ports, embroidered each time, until Africa becomes not just a land, but a canvas of marvels. The Greeks, inheriting Phoenician knowledge, expand on these hints. You walk through the library of Alexandria, scrolls piled high in cedar-scented rooms. Scholars copy reports from Phoenician captains, mixing them with speculation. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, writes of Libya as a land of deserts, beasts, and strange peoples, some with faces of dogs, some without heads at all. Historians debate whether these were distorted accounts of real tribes or pure invention. But they show how Europe's picture of Africa was as much imagination as observation. Roman authors later pick up these tales, layering them into their own writings. Pliny the Elder catalogues animals from Africa, lions, crocodiles, ostriches, but also repeats stories of ants the size of foxes, digging for gold in distant deserts. As you read his words, you smile at the mix of accuracy and absurdity, evidence of how first-hand encounters and sailors' exaggerations entwine. Still, even amid exaggeration, trade continues. You walk a dusty street in Carthage, where Phoenician descendants barter with Berber traders from inland. They exchange amphorae of olive oil for nuggets of gold dust carried across the desert. These routes will later form the backbone of trans-Saharan trade. But for now, they are fragile threads, easily frayed by distance and danger. You pause at the edge of Cape Bojador in legend, a place sailors call the end of the world. Here, Phoenician and later Greek ships hesitate. Currents are strong, winds treacherous, and tales of sea monsters multiply. For centuries, Europeans will not push beyond it. Historians remain uncertain whether Phoenicians themselves rounded this cape or stopped short. But the aura of dread it carried shaped the psychology of exploration for generations. As night falls, you sit on a Phoenician deck, the stars mirrored faintly in the Black Sea. The sailors murmur prayers to Melkart, their patron god, and adjust their course by the North Star. Africa lies just over the horizon, vast, silent, and unknowable. They cannot see its interior, but they feel its presence, the steady pull of gold, ivory, and rumor. And you, lulled by the rocking of the ship, sense the beginning of a pattern, Europe's tentative steps toward a continent that will both fascinate and bewilder it for centuries to come. You march along the stone-paved roads of the Roman world, the dust of centuries clinging to your sandals, and ahead of you looms the city of Carthage, rebuilt after its destruction, now a jewel of Rome's African provinces. The scent of olives and crushed grapes hangs in the air, mingling with the salty breath of the Mediterranean. Africa, to Rome, is no longer an enigma, but a breadbasket. Its fertile fields feeding half the empire. Ships loaded with grain leave harbors daily, their sails swelling with wind, bound for Rome where hungry crowds depend on African harvests. You watch a caravan of donkeys laden with sacks of wheat shuffling through city gates, their hooves striking sparks on worn stones. The dollar of its day, you think, is not paper or coin, but grain, and Africa supplies it in abundance. Yet beyond the coast, the land stretches into mystery. Roman geographers sketch maps that show mountains, deserts, and rivers. But the details blur the farther south they go. You sit in a shaded portico as Pliny the Elder dictates descriptions of Africa. Lions prowling, crocodiles lurking in rivers, giraffes gliding like strange spotted towers across plains. His accounts mingle sharp observation with wonder, sometimes wandering into myth. He writes of strange peoples, men with no heads, their faces on their chests, or others with feet so large they could use them as umbrellas against the sun. Historians still argue whether these were misunderstandings of real tribes, perhaps exaggerated reports of body art, tall shields, or unfamiliar clothing, or pure fantasy. You smile at the thought, because in the Roman mind, Africa is both real and dreamlike, a canvas for imagination. You join a Roman military expedition moving south from the province of Numidia into the Sahara. Soldiers march in tight formations, their shields clanging, their eyes squinting against the glare of endless dunes. Camels carry water jars and supplies, led by Berber guides who know the desert's secrets. The soldiers seek garamantes, desert dwellers reputed to drive chariots across the sand. You watch as the Romans, sweating beneath their helmets, stare in disbelief when they indeed encountered chariots skimming across dunes. The Garamantes' underground irrigation tunnels, ingenious channels tapping hidden aquifers, astonish Roman observers. A quirky note emerges. Roman writers claim the Garamantes hunted Ethiopian cave dwellers by driving them out with smoke. Were these real people, or caricatures of unfamiliar tribes? The truth is lost in the haze of time. The Roman presence reaches deeper along trade routes. In Leptis Magna, you wander marketplaces where merchants trade amphorae of wine and oil for ivory tusks and leopard skins carried north by caravans. Traders whisper of great rivers inland, the Niger, perhaps. But their courses remain unknown. Caravans stretch for miles, camels swaying, their loads glinting faintly with gold dust. The trans-Saharan trade hums quietly, a pulse linking the empire to lands it cannot fully see. In Alexandria, the empire's great eastern port, you hear a different hum. Sailors preparing for voyages down the Red Sea. Roman merchants, armed with the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, sail along Africa's east coast, reaching places like Adulis in modern Eritrea and farther south to a place they call Rapta. Here they barter cloth, wine, and metal tools for ivory, tortoiseshell, and slaves. Yet uncertainty clouds the details. Was Rapta in Tanzania or somewhere else entirely? Scholars still debate, piecing together fragments from texts and archaeology. You, standing on a deck where sailors peer anxiously at coastlines unfamiliar, feel the uncertainty like a fog. Animals from Africa flood Roman arenas, transforming myth into spectacle. You walk into the Colosseum on a summer afternoon, where a crowd roars as gates swing open. A giraffe steps timidly into the arena, its long neck swaying. For Romans, this is a wonder beyond imagining, a creature so strange it seems stitched from fantasy. Lions leap from cages, elephants trumpet, crocodiles thrash in pools hastily dug for the show. Quirky stories survive. An emperor once paraded a hippopotamus through the streets, baffling the crowds who had no word for such a beast. To Romans, Africa is a menagerie, a land that provides the wild, the dangerous, and the marvelous. Yet even as the empire thrives, its limits remain stark. Roman expeditions into Africa never press far beyond the desert's edge. Geographers can sketch the Mediterranean coast in detail, but the heart of the continent remains blank parchment. Historians argue about scattered references. Did Roman soldiers ever reach Lake Chad? Did traders glimpse the Niger River? No firm evidence survives, only tantalizing hints. You picture a Roman centurion squinting at an endless savanna, unable to know he stands on the edge of a continent far larger than his maps admit. As Rome declines, its hold on Africa frays. Caravans keep moving, trade continues, but the empire's curiosity fades into survival. Yet the memory lingers. Africa as a place of bounty, mystery, and marvel. When later Europeans look outward again, they will inherit not only Roman roads and ruins, but also Roman imaginations, colored by myths of headless men and giant-footed tribes. For now, you watch the sun set behind the ruins of Leptis Magna, shadows stretching long across empty plazas. The empire that once reached for Africa's secrets retreats, leaving the question of what lies beyond the desert unanswered. And in the twilight, as the desert wind rises, you hear it. A whisper that Africa remains waiting, patient and vast, its rivers and forests unseen, its story unfinished in European eyes. You step into the medieval world, where Europe's horizons feel narrower than Rome's, but its imaginations, in some ways, even more vivid. Castles rise above misty fields, monasteries glow with candlelight, and merchants in woolen cloaks trudge through muddy markets. Africa, to these Europeans, is both near and impossibly far. They know its name, they taste its goods, they hear its stories, but only in fragments carried across deserts and seas by others. You stand in Venice, the salty air thick with the smell of spice and tar, where merchants unload cargoes brought by Islamic traders from North Africa. You hear coins clink as pepper, cinnamon, and ivory pass from hand to hand. Gold dust from West Africa. carried across the Sahara by camel caravans, enters European circulation here, its origin a mystery to the buyers who prize it. They call the distant source Guinea or Sudan, words that float without precise geography. Scholars still argue whether medieval Europeans had any clear concept of West Africa's kingdoms, or if they simply imagined golden cities beyond the desert. In Genoa, you hear merchants whisper about Tunis, Cairo, and Alexandria, cosmopolitan cities of the Islamic world where African and Asian goods mingle. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land pass through these ports, carrying stories of black-skinned peoples, rich rulers, and vast rivers. Yet the stories are often warped, colored by awe or fear. You sit in a tavern where a traveler insists he has heard of a king so wealthy he throws gold dust into the air during parades. He speaks, unknowingly, of Mansa Musa of Mali, who in 1324 made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca, distributing so much gold along the way that prices in Cairo warped for years. Quirky details cling to these stories. Cairo's chroniclers write of Mansa Musa's generosity, but European storytellers exaggerate it into myth, imagining streets paved in gold and palaces glittering like the sun. By the time you hear these tales in Paris or Florence, they have become half fable, half history. Children sketch maps where Africa is painted with golden crowns, elephants, and mysterious beasts. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean in Iberia, Christian kingdoms fight their long reconquista, pushing against Muslim-held lands. Africa looms close, just across the Strait of Gibraltar. Sailors in Seville and Lisbon look southward, the dark silhouette of Morocco visible on clear days. And yet, few dare cross, for it belongs to powerful Islamic dynasties. Instead, African goods reach them indirectly, through Moorish intermediaries. You sit at a dusty roadside inn in Castile, where merchants sip wine and trade gossip of Almoravid and Almohad rulers, their armies mounted on camels, their wealth fed by the trade of salt, slaves, and gold. You follow pilgrims bound for Rome or Santiago de Compostela, who meet North Africans along their routes. They carry back tales of desert traders who speak languages like flowing water, who wear robes dyed indigo blue, whose caravans stretch for miles across the dunes. Yet even as contact flickers, Europe itself has few direct eyes on Africa. Instead, monks in scriptoria copy classical texts, Herodotus, Pliny, Ptolemy, and fill their maps with inherited guesses. Africa on these parchments is not so much mapped as imagined. Its rivers drawn straight like veins, its mountains shaped like perfect cones, its coasts abruptly ending in monsters. You sit beside one such monk in a chilly abbey. He dips his quill into ink, sketching Africa with fanciful detail. In the margins, he draws dog-headed men, headless tribes with eyes in their chests, and rivers teeming with crocodiles. He smiles faintly, not knowing whether these are real, but confident they belong in the story. Historians still debate whether such maps were meant to be literal or symbolic, teaching moral lessons rather than geography. Yet for you, watching candlelight flicker across the page, the line between fact and faith feels beautifully blurred. In the 12th and 13th centuries, European merchants joined crusades, bringing them into deeper contact with the Islamic world. They taste sugar, imported from plantations established in the Mediterranean, and marvel at ivory carvings sold in Levantine markets. You hold one in your hand, smooth, pale, carved into the shape of a saint. The ivory, of course, came from African elephants, but the merchant selling it shrugs when you ask where. For him, the journey is untraceable, a chain of middlemen stretching beyond comprehension. Quirky anecdotes abound. In England, some nobles wear jewelry fashioned from ostrich eggs imported from Africa. though few believe such birds are real. In France, tapestries depict African animals from second-hand descriptions: lions drawn like oversized hounds, elephants resembling swollen cows with tusks. To medieval minds, Africa is as much legend as geography. Its creatures part of the great menagerie of God's creation, and yet, beneath the myths, real threads of contact tighten. North African scholars like Ibn Khaldun write of kingdoms in the Sahel, Mali, Ghana, Songhai, whose riches flow northward. Their works reach European ears indirectly, sparking both curiosity and envy. In Florence, you overhear bankers muttering about African gold, wondering how to tap it directly without relying on Muslim traders. This desire simmers quietly, waiting for the age of maritime exploration. By the end of the medieval period, you stand on a cliff in Portugal, the Atlantic stretching west, Africa to the south, its coasts known only in fragments. Fishermen whisper of strange currents. Merchants dream of direct access to gold and spices. Monks copy maps filled with both truth and fantasy. Africa remains close enough to taste, but distant enough to remain unknowable. And as the sun sets, staining the sea crimson, you realize Europe is on the edge of a great pivot. Soon the sails of exploration will unfurl, and the first deliberate steps toward Africa's discovery will begin. You find yourself in the chill wind of the North Atlantic, where longships slice through gray waves like sharpened blades. The Vikings, those restless seafarers of Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, are famed for their raids on Britain, their settlements in Greenland, and even their distant leap to Vinland across the Western Ocean. Yet in the sagas they leave behind, there are whispers of journeys southward too, faint traces of Africa brushing against the edges of their restless horizons. You lean against a carved dragon prow as a skald recites tales in the flicker of firelight. He speaks of journeys down the coast of Europe, past Spain, into warmer waters where the sun beats harsh and the skin of the people they meet is dark. Some of these encounters might be echoes of Viking contact with North Africans during raids on Muslim Spain. Others might be exaggerations, sagas stitched together from rumor and myth. Historians still argue whether the Norse truly reached Africa itself, or if their tales merely reflect encounters with Muslim traders in Iberia. For you, seated on the wooden planks of the ship, the ambiguity itself feels like the sea. Wide, uncertain, always shifting. You walk into Al-Andalus in the 9th century, where Viking raids on the Iberian Peninsula clash with the sophisticated Muslim cities of Córdoba and Seville. Chronicles describe longboats pushing into the Guadalquivir River, flames rising from villages. And yet, a century later, Viking merchants are described visiting these same cities peacefully, trading walrus ivory, furs, and amber for silver, silk, and spices. In those bustling markets, it is possible that Norsemen glimpsed African goods: ivory tusks, ostrich feathers, and even enslaved peoples carried north from the Sahara. A quirky note: some sagas mention blummen, literally blue men, a term that scholars think referred to dark-skinned peoples from Africa, though whether the Norse saw them firsthand or heard of them through Muslim intermediaries remains debated. In Icelandic manuscripts, you find curious references to lands of intense heat, where the sun blazes and the inhabitants differ sharply from northern peoples. One tale suggests voyages down the Atlantic coast beyond Spain, perhaps even brushing Morocco or Mauritania. But the sagas are slippery. Part memory, part poetry, part exaggeration. Historians still dispute whether Vikings ever touched African shores or if their stories are just echoes of second-hand tales absorbed into Norse imagination. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, traders carry African goods home through complex networks. You step into Birka, a bustling Viking trading town in Sweden. In the market square, you spot ivory carvings and beads of African origin. passed along through Muslim traders in the East or through Moorish merchants in Spain. To the Vikings, these objects are both exotic and practical, woven into their economy without requiring direct journeys south. A quirky discovery surfaces centuries later. Archaeologists unearth coins from North Africa in Viking graves, evidence that even in death, the Norse carried fragments of Africa with them. But the Viking relationship with Africa remains more whisper than shout. Unlike their bold leaps westward, their southern forays leave few concrete traces. You sit in a smoky longhouse while warriors argue over whether the stories of sunburned men are truth or fable. One insists he saw them, describing dark skin glistening under an unbearable sun. Another scoffs, claiming such tales are metaphors for spiritual battles. The uncertainty lingers like smoke in your hair. Was Africa truly glimpsed by Norse eyes, or only imagined through the retelling of others' travels? As the Viking Age wanes and Europe shifts into the high medieval period, their sagas fade into legend. Yet their fleeting mentions of Africa remind you how the continent loomed even at the far edge of northern imagination. From Scandinavia's frozen fjords, Africa was not a place to be mapped, but a place to be dreamed of. A land of warmth, richness, and mystery at the edge of the world's canvas. You stand once more on the prow of a long ship, the wind whipping your cloak, and look southward. Whether they reached Africa's shores or not, the Norse left behind a tantalizing echo that even the people of the North, so far removed, could not resist weaving Africa into their stories. The dragon prow creaks, the sea spray chills your skin, and you sense the enduring pattern, Europeans dreaming of Africa before truly stepping into its embrace. You stand on the cliffs of Sagres in Portugal, the Atlantic stretching away in a gray-blue sweep, its horizon both promise and peril. The year is the early 15th century, and Europe has shifted. The Crusades have faded into memory. The Reconquista has pushed Muslim kingdoms south, and the Iberian kingdoms, Spain and Portugal, now look beyond their borders with restless eyes. Here, on this wind-battered promontory, Prince Henry of Portugal, later called the Navigator, gazes southward toward Africa. You hear the cry of gulls and the crash of surf against black rock. Small caravels, agile ships with triangular lateen sails, bob below the cliffs. They are unlike the bulky cogs that once plied northern seas. These ships are meant to edge into the unknown, to tack against the wind, to return where square sails might founder. You smell tar and fresh wood, the tools of a shipyard where men hammer planks into place. The sailors speak in hushed tones of Guinea, of gold so plentiful it flows like sand, of pepper that burns the tongue, of seas guarded by monsters. The Portuguese begin cautiously. They hug the coastline of Morocco, then the western Sahara, rarely venturing far. In 1415, they seize Ceuta, a port city just across the Strait of Gibraltar, their first permanent foothold on African soil. You walk through Ceuta's bustling market where Berber traders sell leather, salt, and copper. Somewhere in the shadows, you glimpse a nugget of gold, carried across the desert by caravan. This, more than spices or land, is what draws Europe southward. The golden pulse of West Africa, trickling north through Islamic trade networks. Quirky details surface. Sailors tell of the Canary Islands, where native Guanche people resist European incursions with slings and stones. In Madeira, settlers experiment with sugarcane, realizing that the plant thrives in warm soils. They bring enslaved laborers from Africa to work these plantations, a small beginning of a system that will one day cast a vast shadow. For now, it feels like a footnote. One more experiment in Portugal's restless search for wealth. Prince Henry does not sail himself, despite his epithet. Instead, he gathers mapmakers, astronomers, and shipbuilders at his court. You sit in a candlelit hall where charts are spread across tables, their coastlines sketched in ink, their blank spaces yawning wide. Mariners return from each voyage with new notes. A cape here, a river there, an island glimpsed through mist. The maps grow more detailed, yet the heart of Africa remains hidden. Historians still debate whether Henry truly created a school of navigation, or whether later chroniclers exaggerated his role. What is certain is that under his patronage, voyages continue, each pushing a little farther south. Sailors describe fierce currents near Cape Bojador, a place long feared as impassable. They speak of seas that boil, of waters that trap ships, of heat so intense it kills. For centuries, this cape has been a psychological barrier. Ships turn back rather than face it. You walk the deck of a caravel as it drifts near the cape, the crew muttering prayers, their eyes scanning for sea monsters. The horizon glimmers with heat, and the air grows heavy. The fear is palpable, almost tangible, and yet, beyond the myths, small victories accumulate. Portuguese captains trade along the coast of Mauritania, bringing back ostrich feathers, gum, and a little gold. They capture Africans too, some enslaved, some ransomed. You see them march through Lisbon's streets, their presence both exotic and unsettling to city dwellers. Chroniclers write with fascination of people of the color of night, their words betraying both curiosity and prejudice. Still, the allure of Africa grows. The Pope grants Portugal the right to claim lands south of Cape Bojador, even those not yet discovered, as long as they spread Christianity. The language of exploration is wrapped in religion, but the heartbeat of the venture is trade. Gold, pepper, ivory, and labor. You pause in Lisbon's harbor as another voyage prepares to depart. Sailors load barrels of wine, sacks of biscuits, and casks of water. On deck, a pilot checks an astrolabe, holding it against the sky, measuring angles of stars. These are the tools that will chip away at the darkness on maps. A quirky moment. One sailor carries a pigeon in a basket, intending to release it if they lose sight of land. Trusting the bird to guide them back, a fragile line of hope in an ocean of uncertainty. By the time Prince Henry dies in 1460, the Portuguese have sailed as far south as Sierra Leone. The psychological wall of Cape Bojador has not yet been breached, but the momentum is unstoppable. Trade trickles back, maps grow clearer, and Europe's appetite sharpens. Africa is no longer just rumor. It is coastline, river mouths, villages glimpsed from decks, goods carried into Lisbon's markets. As night falls on the cliffs of Sagres, you stand where Henry once stood, gazing southward. The stars blaze overhead, the same stars that guide caravels inching along the African coast. You sense the shift. Europe is no longer content to imagine Africa through the words of others. Now, it seeks to see for itself. And though the journey is only beginning, the sails are unfurled, the winds are favorable, and the continent lies waiting, vast and silent, just beyond the horizon. You stand on the deck of a small caravel in the year 1434, the ropes creaking softly as the ship sways. Ahead lies Cape Bojador, a name sailors whisper with dread. For centuries, this cape has been a line on the map that no European dared to cross. They say the waters beyond boil, the winds never relent, and monsters rise from the depths to devour ships. Even hardened mariners make the sign of the cross when they speak its name. You taste the salt in the air and feel the tension vibrating through the crew. No one knows what lies beyond. At the helm is Gil Eanes, a Portuguese captain entrusted by Prince Henry himself. His face is weathered, his eyes fixed firmly southward. He has failed before, turning back at the edge of this cursed cape. But now he tries again, with a sturdier ship, better provisions, and the encouragement of those who believe that Africa's secrets are worth the risk. The sail bellies with wind as the ship pushes forward, its timbers groaning. Every man aboard knows the risk, yet none turn back. You stand at the rail as the coastline approaches, the land jutting out like a clenched fist. The sea grows rougher, waves slamming against the hull. Sailors mutter prayers, some fingering small wooden crosses, others clutching talismans. A quirky sight catches your eye. One sailor, too poor for charms, rubs the handle of his knife for luck, whispering that the blade has always kept him safe. The ship edges closer. The feared waters churn, but they do not boil. No monsters appear. The heat is fierce, but not fatal. Gil Eanes presses on, his hand steady on the tiller. Then, at last, the caravel slips past the cape, its prow cutting into seas no European ship has recorded before. Relief sweeps the deck. Laughter, cheers, tears of disbelief. The barrier that terrified generations has been shattered in a single voyage. Historians later note this as a turning point. A psychological wall crumbling, opening the way for centuries of expansion. On shore, the crew lands near a barren stretch, collecting a few wild roses to prove they had reached beyond the cape. These simple flowers, dried and carried back to Portugal, become evidence more convincing than tales. They symbolize victory, not just over nature, but over fear itself. You imagine the scene. Sailors returning to Lisbon, presenting roses from the forbidden coast, their faces glowing with triumph. Yet questions remain. Did Gil Eanes sail far beyond the Cape, or merely skirt its edge? Historians still argue, parsing vague accounts. But for you, standing on that deck, the exact distance hardly matters. What matters is that the myth of impassable seas has been broken. In Lisbon, word spreads quickly. Merchants dream of gold flowing freely, of spices and ivory to be tapped directly, without Muslim middlemen. The Pope, already supportive of Portuguese claims, praises the feat as proof of divine favor. Caravels are built in greater numbers, their sails patched but sturdy, their compasses pointing ever southward. You stroll through the docks as sailors prepare for new voyages. Barrels of wine and biscuits are loaded, astrolabes polished, charts inked with slightly longer coastlines. A quirky moment. A cabin boy, no more than 12, proudly carries a live rooster aboard, declaring it will crow at dawn to keep them safe from evil spirits. The others laugh, but let him keep it, grateful for any superstition that eases the tension. As voyages multiply, Cape Bojador becomes less a monster and more a milestone. Portuguese ships push farther, reaching the coasts of Western Sahara, then Senegal. The tales of boiling seas fade into memory, replaced by real encounters. Fishermen casting nets, villages perched along shores, rivers flowing into the ocean. Africa is no longer a blank terror. It is land, people, trade. You stand again on Sagres cliffs, the wind tugging at your cloak. Below, caravels sail south, their sails bright against the deep Atlantic. What once seemed impossible now feels inevitable. The world has grown larger, not through conquest or maps, but through the simple act of passing a line no one thought could be crossed. As night falls, you hear sailors singing softly on the water, their voices rising with the wind. The song is not of fear, but of hope. Beyond Cape Bojador lies a new horizon, and Europe, at last, dares to chase it. You sail now along the lengthening coastline of West Africa in the mid-15th century, where the air grows warmer, the waters deeper blue, and the lands greener and more abundant. The caravels creak as their sails catch steady winds, guiding Portuguese explorers farther than any before them. Past Cape Bojador, the unknown turns into a series of discoveries. Rivers winding inland, villages dotting the shores, and markets bustling with goods that Europe had only heard of in whispers. You stand at the rail as the ship glides past the Senegal River, its waters glinting under the sun. Fishermen in dugout canoes paddle gracefully, their nets cast with practiced ease. The Portuguese sailors lean over the rail, curious, some offering trinkets, beads of glass, iron tools, scraps of cloth, in exchange for fish and small curiosities. A quirky moment breaks the tension when a sailor offers a brass bell, and the villagers laugh heartily at its ringing, mimicking the sound until the whole shoreline seems filled with a chorus of bells. Gold, however, is what truly drives these voyages. You follow caravans inland through stories carried back to Lisbon, where merchants describe nuggets exchanged for modest goods, dust gleaming in gourds, wealth flowing north through routes Europeans had never controlled. The kingdom of Mali, though distant from the coast, still radiates its legendary aura, the memory of Mansa Musa's golden pilgrimage lingering in European minds. Historians still debate how much gold Portuguese captains actually acquired in these early voyages. Some records describe small quantities, others hint at significant exchanges. But the hunger is undeniable. The Gambia River becomes another landmark. You watch as sailors steer caravels upriver, their eyes wide at the sight of crocodiles basking on mudbanks and hippos surfacing with snorts that echo across the water. Some sailors cross themselves, whispering about river monsters. A quirky note appears in one log. A sailor describes the hippo as a horse that lives in water, with a voice like thunder. Scholars chuckle at the confusion, but you can sense the awe that gripped men seeing such creatures for the first time. Along the coast, pepper becomes a prize almost as sought after as gold. Known as malagueta, this spicy grain of paradise fills the holds of ships, destined to season European dishes with exotic fire. In Lisbon, nobles sprinkle it on meats, marveling at its sharpness, not realizing it is not the same as Indian pepper, but an entirely different plant. Still, the trade flourishes, and West Africa's reputation as a source of both spice and gold grows. You pause in a coastal village where Portuguese sailors meet local rulers. Gifts are exchanged: red cloth for ivory bangles, iron blades for gold dust. Interpreters, often drawn from earlier voyages, bridge languages with a mix of gestures, broken words, and patience. Historians remain uncertain how much mutual understanding existed in these first contacts. But you sense in the exchanges both curiosity and caution. Then comes the darker current, the capture of people. On some voyages, Portuguese sailors seize men, women, and children, bringing them back to Lisbon as slaves. You watch silently as captives shuffle down gangplanks, their eyes darting at strange stone buildings and foreign crowds. Chroniclers describe royal parades in Portugal where enslaved Africans are displayed, their presence both shocking and fascinating to onlookers. A quirky but unsettling story lingers. One Lisbon merchant boasted of parading an African captive dressed in bright silks simply to display his wealth, as if the person were a jewel rather than a human being. Yet trade and alliances also form. In Senegambia, rulers negotiate, weighing Portuguese goods against their own interests. Some see opportunity, others threat. The shoreline becomes a place of bargaining, laughter, suspicion, and experiment. You sit at a fire one night, watching as Portuguese sailors share roasted fish with villagers, exchanging songs whose words neither side understands, but whose melodies carry warmth across the divide. By the 1460s, ships sail past Cape Verde, discovering islands that become bases for further voyages. Here, sugarcane is planted, and enslaved Africans are forced to labor on plantations, the first shadows of a system that will expand brutally across the Atlantic. At this stage, it is small, experimental, yet ominous. You walk the streets of Lisbon where goods pour in, gold dust gleaming in pouches, ivory carved into delicate crucifixes, pepper pungent in sacks, and enslaved people marched through markets. Crowds gape at their unfamiliar features, some with fascination, others with prejudice. Scholars debate whether this moment marks the true beginning of Europe's sustained encounter with sub-Saharan Africa, or whether it was still a tentative testing of waters. For you, standing in the harbor where sails are furled and cargo unloaded, the momentum is unmistakable. The coast of West Africa stretches on like a scroll slowly unrolled, each voyage adding lines to Europe's maps. What was once rumor becomes shoreline. What was once fear becomes trade. And yet, beneath the exchanges of goods and gifts, you sense the undercurrent of what is to come. A relationship marked not just by curiosity and commerce, but also by conquest and exploitation. As the sun sets over the Atlantic, painting the waves gold and crimson, you lean on the ship's rail. The coast behind glimmers with fires from villages, the sea ahead whispers with promise. West Africa is no longer a silhouette on the horizon. It is vivid, real, alive. And Europe, with sails taut and ambitions sharpened, will not turn back. You drift down the coast of Central Africa, where the shoreline grows lush and the rivers wide, until you find yourself at the mouth of a mighty waterway. The Congo River. The year is the 1480s, and Portuguese caravels, their sails white against the emerald forest backdrop, nudge cautiously into the current. The river surges with a power that rattles timbers and unnerves sailors unused to such immensity. It is not just a river. It feels like a highway into the unknown heart of the continent. On the banks, smoke rises from villages tucked beneath towering trees. Drums echo across the water, a rhythm foreign and mesmerizing. The Portuguese have reached the Kingdom of Congo, one of the most sophisticated states they will encounter in Africa. Here, rulers govern not only villages, but provinces, a hierarchy of nobles and officials, with armies and courts that rival Europe's own structures. You walk into Mbanza, Congo, the capital, where wide avenues and bustling markets astonish the Europeans. Ivory tusks lean against stalls, raffia cloth gleams in the sun, and carved wooden figures stare with solemn eyes. The first meetings between Portuguese envoys and the Manicongo, the king of Congo, are cautious but respectful. Gifts are exchanged, mirrors, crucifixes, and fine cloth from Europe, while the Congolese offer ivory, copper, and slaves taken from rival peoples. A quirky detail emerges from these encounters. Portuguese sailors, unused to raffia cloth, marvel at its texture and even cut pieces into small squares to keep as souvenirs. Meanwhile, Congolese nobles examine European hats and swords with equal curiosity, sometimes adopting them into their attire in surprising combinations. Over time, diplomacy deepens. Envoys from Congo travel to Lisbon, where they walk the marble streets and bow before the Portuguese king. Imagine the astonishment of Lisbon's citizens as they watch African nobles in embroidered robes stride through palaces. Their presence proof that distant kingdoms are not only real, but regal. Historians still argue about the degree of equality in these early relations. Some see them as mutual curiosity and cooperation. Others as the first steps in a pattern of manipulation and imbalance. Back in Congo, Christianity begins to weave its way into royal courts. Missionaries preach in newly built churches, their bells ringing across markets. The Manicongo Nzinga Nkuwu even takes baptism, adopting the Christian name João the Refrigerator. You hear the solemn chant of hymns sung in Kikongo, a fusion of local rhythms with European liturgy. Quirky anecdotes surface. Some villagers, confused by the new rituals, mix Christian symbols with older practices, creating hybrid traditions that puzzle missionaries but persist nonetheless. Trade flourishes along the river. Portuguese merchants load ships with ivory tusks so large they require several men to lift. With copper bracelets coiled in gleaming piles, and with enslaved people marched in chains from battlefields. In return, they bring cloth, beads, and iron weapons, goods that reshape local economies. The balance is fragile. Some Congolese rulers welcome the alliance, seeing Portuguese support as a tool against rivals. Others bristle at the growing dependence. You sit in a dimly lit hall where Congolese nobles debate the new relationship. One argues that the guns and horses brought by the Portuguese strengthen their armies. Another warns that too much reliance will erode their traditions. Historians still debate whether Congo's early Christianization was genuine devotion or a political strategy. You sense it was both, a blend of faith, pragmatism, and survival. The Congo River itself becomes a stage for wonder. Portuguese sailors write of its cataracts, roaring falls that shake the earth, so powerful that boats cannot pass. They marvel at its fish, some enormous, others brightly colored, unlike any in European waters. A quirky note appears in one log. A sailor swears he saw a fish, as long as 3 men, leap from the water, nearly capsizing a canoe. Whether exaggeration or truth, the story spreads, fueling Europe's image of Africa as a land of marvels. In Lisbon, news of Congo stirs fascination. Maps are updated, showing not blank coasts, but named kingdoms. Merchants boast of profits, missionaries of conversions, and nobles of alliances. Yet beneath the celebration lies the seed of unease. Enslaved Africans from Congo and nearby regions arrive in growing numbers, sold in Lisbon markets, their fates entwined with Europe's hunger for labor. The relationship that began with diplomacy slowly tilts, one step at a time, toward exploitation. Still, for a moment, there is something almost equal in the air. You picture Congolese envoys standing in European courts, speaking proudly of their kingdom, and Portuguese captains bowing before the Manicongo in return. 2 worlds meet, not yet locked in conquest, but in cautious curiosity. As you leave Mbanza, Congo, the drums echo behind you, their rhythm mingling with the crash of Atlantic waves. You sense that this meeting between Europe and Africa is unlike the fleeting trades of earlier coasts. Here, in the Congo, a true encounter has begun, an exchange of power, culture, faith, and goods that will ripple outward for centuries. And as the caravels sail away, their hulls heavy with ivory and copper, the horizon feels charged, as though history itself has shifted course. You grip the rail of a storm-tossed caravel in the year 1488, the salt spray stinging your face as thunder cracks above the Atlantic. Ahead lies the southernmost tip of Africa, a place no European ship has yet rounded. Bartolomeu Dias, a Portuguese captain hardened by countless voyages, is determined to push beyond the limits of maps. The winds howl, the masts groan, and the sailors whisper prayers, certain they are skirting the edge of the world. For weeks, storms drive the ships southward, farther and farther from the coast. The sea is merciless, the horizon blurred by rain. The men argue whether to turn back, but Dias insists on pressing forward. Supplies dwindle, salted meat grows rancid, and barrels of water spoil with algae. A quirky image lingers. One sailor, desperate for relief, chews on a piece of leather from his boot, muttering that it tastes no worse than their rations. At last, the storm clears. The sailors spot land, a jagged coast where waves explode against cliffs. They have passed the tip of Africa without realizing it, swept around by the wind. Only when they turn northward do they understand the truth. They have rounded the continent's southernmost point, Dias names it the Cape of Storms, an apt title for the fury they endured. Later, King John II of Portugal will rename it the Cape of Good Hope, seeing in it the promise of a sea route to India. Historians still debate which name captures the truth more fully, terror or hope. But you sense both clinging to the salt-soaked air. You step ashore briefly, where scrubland stretches inland and penguins shuffle comically on rocky beaches. The sailors laugh nervously at the sight of birds dressed like priests, a quirky detail that finds its way into chronicles back in Lisbon. They explore cautiously, noting rivers, hills, and strange plants. But the real treasure is not what they see, but what they prove. Africa can be rounded. The ocean route to the riches of the East is possible. Dias wishes to sail farther, but his crew, exhausted and near mutiny, insists on turning back. Reluctantly, he agrees. As the ships trace their way home, the significance of their journey sinks in. They have not only survived the Cape, but have glimpsed a route that could break the stranglehold of overland spice trade routes controlled by Venice and Islamic powers. You arrive in Lisbon with Dias, the city erupting in excitement. Merchants dream of spices flowing directly from Asia. Kings envision empires stretching beyond imagination. The voyage is celebrated, yet strangely, Dias himself fades into relative obscurity compared to later navigators. Scholars still puzzle over why his feat, so monumental, did not bring him lasting fame in his own time. Perhaps it was overshadowed by what came next, for though Dias had shown the way, he did not complete the journey. That task would fall to Vasco da Gama a decade later. But standing here, at the end of Dias's voyage, you feel the world tilt. The myths of Africa's impassable barriers, boiling seas, endless deserts, monstrous beasts, have been broken, one after another. The Cape itself stands as proof that oceans are not walls but doors, if only one has the courage to sail through. As you gaze once more at the crashing waves around the Cape of Good Hope, the name feels almost prophetic. Storms may rage, but beyond them lies possibility. Spices, silk, and wealth unimaginable. And with Europe's sails now turned firmly south and east, Africa is no longer a distant rumor. It is the hinge on which global history is beginning to turn. You stand at the docks of Lisbon in 1497, where crowds press shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on 3 caravels and a supply ship preparing to leave. Vasco da Gama, chosen by King Manuel I, leads the expedition. His orders are daring and simple. Reach India by sailing around Africa. The air hums with anticipation. Merchants whisper of fortunes in spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, that could enrich Portugal beyond measure. Priests murmur blessings, sprinkling holy water on sails. Families clutch handkerchiefs, waving tearful farewells to sailors who may never return. You climb aboard one of the ships, the scent of pitch and salted fish mingling with the tension of men ready to face months at sea. The decks creak under the weight of barrels filled with water, wine, flour, and salted meat. A quirky detail catches your attention. Among the supplies is a chest of trumpets and drums, intended not for celebration, but to awe the people they meet. To make European arrivals seem larger than life, the fleet sails south, hugging the familiar coasts of West Africa. At the Cape Verde Islands, they replenish supplies before venturing farther. The air grows hotter, the men swelter in heavy clothes, and diseases spread in the humid air. By December, the ships round the Cape of Good Hope. Storm winds once again battering masts and shredding sails. You hear sailors curse the sea, their voices hoarse with exhaustion. Yet they endure, pressing into waters no European fleet has fully conquered. Moving up Africa's eastern coast, they encounter cities unlike any in Europe's imagination. In In Mozambique, Kilwa, and Mombasa, they see stone houses, bustling markets, and ships from Arabia and India anchored in harbors. These are Swahili city-states, prosperous hubs of trade long connected to the Indian Ocean world. Spices, ivory, gold, and textiles pass through their ports in a rhythm older than Portugal's ambitions. The encounters are uneasy. In Mozambique, da Gama presents gifts, wool cloth, tin, and corals, that locals dismiss as trifles. They expect riches befitting powerful rulers. The Portuguese feel humbled, realizing their offerings are meager compared to the wealth already circulating in the Indian Ocean. A quirky but telling story emerges. Some local merchants laugh openly at Portuguese copper, calling it worthless compared to their gold. For sailors who thought themselves emissaries of a rich kingdom, it is a sobering lesson. In Mombasa, tensions flare. Suspecting hostility, the Portuguese leave quickly, wary of ambush. Then, in Malindi, fortune turns. The Sultan welcomes them, providing guides and interpreters. Among them is a skilled navigator, often identified in chronicles as a Gujarati pilot, who helps da Gama's ships cross the vast Indian Ocean. Historians still debate his exact identity. Was he Arab, Indian, or Swahili? But his role was crucial. Without his knowledge of monsoon winds and ocean currents, the voyage might have failed. You feel the shift as the fleet leaves Africa's coast behind. The sails fill with steady monsoon winds, carrying the ships eastward into the open sea. For weeks, the horizon is nothing but sky and water. Men grow restless, food spoils, scurvy ravages gums and teeth. Yet the promise of riches keeps them steady. Finally, after months at sea, the ships sight land. Calicut, on India's Malabar coast. The arrival is monumental. You stand with da Gama as he steps onto foreign soil, spices heavy in the air, merchants in fine robes approaching with curiosity. Here, in the bustling marketplace, Portuguese ambitions crystallize. They have found the route to India, and Africa, the vast continent they circled, was the bridge that made it possible. Back in Lisbon, the return is celebrated as triumph. Ships arrive laden with spices, their fragrance filling the harbor. Crowds cheer, bells toll, and King Manuel styles himself Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. The age of empires has begun, and yet Africa remains more than a stepping stone. Along the coast, forts are built, alliances forged, and rivalries sparked. The Swahili city-states, once confident in their trade networks, now feel the weight of European intrusion. Some resist, others bargain. Historians still argue whether da Gama's voyage should be seen as discovery or disruption, triumph or trespass. For you, walking among the spice sacks in Lisbon's markets, the meaning is clear. Africa has become entangled in Europe's vision of the world, not as a distant rumor, but as a necessary, living part of global history. As the fleet is dismantled and the sailors scatter into Lisbon's alleys, you look back at the map of their journey. The lines trace down the coast of Africa, around the stormy Cape, up through vibrant Swahili ports, and across the sea to India. Each stop, each encounter, each awkward exchange of gifts and glances stitched Africa more firmly into Europe's story of expansion. The sails are furled, the voyage is celebrated. But you sense this is only the beginning. The next chapters will not be about passing Africa, but about staying, building forts, establishing colonies, and altering the rhythms of life on its shores forever. You sit at a wooden desk in Lisbon, a candle guttering beside you as mapmakers lean over parchment. Their quills scratch steadily, ink darkening coastlines that only a generation earlier were blank. Africa, once a silhouette, now stretches in detail. Capes and bays, rivers and islands, marked carefully from the notes of sailors. Yet between the known harbors and promontories, the mapmakers fill the gaps with imagination. You watch one cartographer sketch a mountain range, though he has never seen it. Only heard vague references from a sailor who glimpsed peaks through haze. Another, in the margin, draws a beast with scales and wings, labeling it as a dragon of the southern seas. Quirky details bloom on these maps. Sea monsters writhing beyond capes, men with dog heads labeled cynocephaly, rivers pouring from mountains of gold. Historians today still debate whether these monsters were meant literally or symbolically. But for sailors then, they were warnings etched in ink. As Portuguese voyages press farther, maps grow stranger. One shows the fabled mountains of the moon, thought to be the source of the Nile, their peaks capped with snow even though the mapmaker never left Lisbon. Another draws the legendary kingdom of Prester John, a Christian monarch said to rule somewhere in Africa's interior, a figure Europeans long to find as an ally against Islam. You lean close to the parchment and smile faintly, realizing that for all their new accuracy, these maps remain equal parts fact and dream. In the harbors, sailors laugh at some of these inventions, but others swear by them. You overhear one insisting he saw mermaids off the coast of Sierra Leone, likely manatees, though he describes them with flowing hair and enchanting songs. Another claims the sea grows so hot near the equator that water bubbles like a cauldron. Even after voyages disproved such myths, they lingered in tavern tales, repeated until they took on a life of their own. Printed books spread these images farther. You open a volume in Nuremberg, the woodcuts showing Africa filled with lions, elephants, and unicorns. European readers, who would never see the continent themselves, accept these images as truth. To them, Africa is a land where riches mingle with terrors, where kingdoms gleam with gold but lurk beside monstrous tribes. A quirky footnote appears. In one German book, a giraffe is described as a camel with the neck of a swan and the spots of a leopard. The blend of observation and imagination becomes Europe's window onto Africa. The myths are not only of beasts. Rivers are exaggerated, stretching across entire maps, connecting seas that in reality never meet. The Nile, in particular, fascinates Europeans. You follow lines drawn confidently, tracing it from the Mediterranean deep into the continent, though no European has followed it so far. Historians still argue whether reports from Arab geographers influenced these guesses or whether they were entirely fanciful. Either way, the Nile's mystery becomes one of Africa's defining symbols, a riddle waiting to be solved. You pause in a Swahili port like Kilwa, hearing how locals laugh gently at Europeans' questions about Prester John or mythical rivers. To them, Africa is not myth but home, its trade networks well established, its roots known. Yet Europeans cling to their stories, using them to justify further exploration. They convince themselves that if monsters roam the seas, then only the brave may defeat them. If Christian kings await inland, then alliances must be forged. The myths fuel the sails as much as wind. In Lisbon's royal court, King Manuel studies these maps. His advisors point to drawings of elephants and palaces, promising that Africa holds not only wealth but wonders. They imagine Africa as both obstacle and opportunity, a continent to be crossed, circled, and ultimately entered. You sense their excitement, their greed, and their ignorance blending into a potent mix. Quirky details creep into everyday life. In Portuguese markets, ivory carvings shaped into saints sit beside rosaries, while children play with shells brought from African coasts, imagining them as tokens of distant kingdoms. In churches, priests preach sermons likening Africa's gold to biblical treasures, weaving exploration into faith. Myths are not confined to maps. They saturate culture, thought, and imagination. And yet, beneath the dragons and golden mountains, the outlines of the real Africa slowly emerge. Each voyage brings more precise details. Each harbor visited becomes a firm dot on the map. Each encounter with African rulers shifts myth toward memory. Historians still debate whether these early maps reflect more ignorance or knowledge. But for you, holding one in candlelight, the answer feels like both. Africa, to Europe, is still a dream, but one that is beginning to sharpen into focus. As dawn rises over Lisbon, casting golden light on parchment and ink, you realize the power of these maps. They are not merely guides. They are promises. They tell Europeans that the world is larger, stranger, and more attainable than they ever imagined. And though many of their beasts and kingdoms will fade into fantasy, the lines of coast and river will remain, guiding sails southward and eastward, pulling Europe ever deeper into Africa's embrace. You step into a bustling coastal town in West Africa at the close of the 15th century, where the air is thick with the mingled scents of salt, palm oil, and roasted fish. Wooden huts stand beside market stalls shaded by woven mats, and voices rise in a dozen languages, some local, some foreign. The sea, rolling in steady waves, has become a crossroads, and Europeans are no longer rare strangers here. They are part of the rhythm, awkwardly woven into the fabric of daily life. You wander through the market. Women balance baskets on their heads, filled with millet, yams, and peppers. Portuguese sailors bargain noisily, offering cloth dyed in bright scarlets and blues, iron nails, and copper bracelets. In exchange, they receive ivory tusks, sacks of malagueta pepper, and even small nuggets of gold. A quirky scene catches your attention. A sailor tries to trade a small hand mirror, holding it up to a laughing child who startles at his own reflection, then bursts into giggles. The crowd joins in, and for a moment, the awkwardness of trade turns into shared amusement. The town is not merely a meeting point of goods, but of cultures. You see Portuguese men eating stews thick with African spices, their tongues burning, their eyes watering, but their pride refusing to let them admit defeat. In turn, local men try Portuguese wine, raising cups hesitantly, grimacing at the unfamiliar sourness, then laughing together at the faces they pull. These exchanges are clumsy, imperfect, but real. Proof that contact is not only conquest or exploitation, but also curiosity. Historians debate how equal these early encounters were. Some argue that local rulers held the upper hand, carefully controlling trade and restricting Europeans to the coast. Others believe Europeans gradually imposed their will. For you, standing in the market as drums beat and sailors haggle, the truth feels mixed. Power flows like a tide, sometimes one way, sometimes another. What is certain is that daily life along the coast has been forever altered. You follow a caravan inland, led by local traders. The Portuguese stay behind, unfamiliar with the routes, mistrusted by those beyond the coast. The caravan winds through forests where monkeys chatter overhead and rivers glint in the sun. At night, fires crackle and stories are told. You hear tales of distant kingdoms, Mali, Songhai, Benin, rich with gold, skilled in governance, proud of their traditions. These stories never make it fully to Lisbon, where maps still show blank spaces. But here, in Africa, the land is never empty. Back on the coast, daily routines adapt to the new presence. Some Africans work as interpreters, learning Portuguese words and gestures. Others ferry goods between ships and shore and dugout canoes, earning wages in cloth or beads. A quirky practice emerges. Portuguese sailors, desperate for fresh food, trade chickens and goats from their ships for fruit and palm wine, creating hybrid meals that astonish both sides. In the evenings, you sit by a fire where sailors and locals share music. The Portuguese strum crude guitars, their strings jangling in unfamiliar rhythms. African drummers answer with complex beats, weaving sound into the night. Slowly, almost shyly, the two rhythms merge, creating something neither has heard before. You sense that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but also in moments like this, when cultures brush against one another and something new flickers to life. Yet shadows stretch across these encounters. Enslavement, once incidental, becomes increasingly deliberate. Some Portuguese captains seize people outright, while others purchase captives from local rulers who wage wars against their neighbors. You see a line of men and women, wrists bound, led toward the shore. Their faces are proud, defiant, or frightened, but all are silent. The sailors avoid their eyes. A market that began in laughter and curiosity now carries a darker undercurrent. Historians still argue whether these early exchanges could have followed another path, whether trade and alliance might have remained central rather than slavery and exploitation. No answer comes, only the ache of possibility. You, standing on the sand as captives are rowed out to ships, feel the weight of choices hardening into patterns. Still, the coast remains alive with daily life. Children chase each other along the beach, merchants shout prices, fishermen mend nets. Europeans are only one thread in a larger tapestry. For most people here, life is not defined by strangers and caravels, but by the steady rhythms of farming, trading, cooking, and worshiping. The world has changed, yet it is still itself. As the sun sets, casting the sea in molten gold, you sit on the shoreline. Behind you, drums throb. Ahead, caravels rock gently, their sails furled, their shadows long across the water. For a moment, the ocean seems to hold both promise and peril in equal measure. Africa and Europe have met not in myth or map, but in the ordinary mess of daily life. Trade, laughter, suspicion, and sorrow. And from this mingling, the future, both luminous and dark, begins to unfold. You walk along the humid coast of West Africa in the late 15th century, where the air carries the heavy scent of salt and wood smoke. And above the surf, you hear the thud of hammers on stone. Rising slowly before your eyes is something new. Forts. No longer content to sail in, trade, and depart. The Portuguese now anchor their presence in stone walls, cannons, and gates. You stand at Elmina in 1482, where Portuguese masons and soldiers, under the command of Diogo de Azambuja, lay the first stones of a great fortress. The local Fetu ruler, intrigued by the potential of alliance, grants them permission to build. Palms sway nearby, villagers watch curiously, and the sound of chisels rings through the air. Within months, a white-walled fortress dominates the coastline, the first major European stronghold in sub-Saharan Africa. From its ramparts, the Portuguese can store goods, mount cannons, and control access to gold fields inland. The fort gleams in the sun, a beacon of Europe's permanence. Inside its walls, life bustles. Merchants unload ivory, pepper, and, increasingly, enslaved captives. Soldiers pace along parapets, their armor rusting in the humid air. Priests erect a chapel where Latin hymns rise over the sound of the sea. A quirky story survives. Sailors, missing the taste of home, try to plant grapevines inside the fort's courtyard, but the vines wither in the tropical climate, leaving them only with barrels of imported wine. You step into the markets outside Elmina, where African traders gather with gold dust, cloth, and captives from inland wars. They bargain shrewdly, demanding better goods than the trinkets Europeans once offered. Now firearms, iron tools, and fine cloth from India. carried by Portuguese ships, circulate alongside African products. The balance of trade shifts constantly. Some rulers grow rich, others wary. Historians still debate whether the construction of forts marked a turning point of domination, or whether African states remained in control for decades to come. Further south, along Angola's coast, the Portuguese established Luanda. The town begins as a trading post, but grows into another fortified foothold. You walk its narrow streets, where stone warehouses line the shore, filled with goods destined for Lisbon. The conversations you overhear are uneasy. African rulers question Portuguese motives, while captains complain of resistance from inland kingdoms. Yet still the forts multiply, anchoring Europe more firmly. Daily life around these forts is a mixture of tension and adaptation. African women marry Portuguese men, creating families that bridge cultures. Children grow up speaking both Portuguese and Kikongo or Akan, carrying hybrid traditions. At night, fires burn near the walls as markets continue, laughter mingling with suspicion. A quirky image arises. Portuguese soldiers complain of parrots that roost in the fort's towers, squawking phrases they have overheard, mocking the guards in their own language. Religion flows with the forts. Missionaries accompany garrisons, baptizing rulers and their families. In Congo, entire noble households convert to Christianity, though often blending it with older beliefs. Wooden crucifixes carved by Congolese artisans take on local styles. Christ depicted with African features, saints adorned with local patterns. Historians argue whether this was genuine conversion or political strategy. But for you, hearing the hymns sung in Kikongo, it feels like a meeting of worlds rather than a replacement. Yet beneath trade and faith lies the swelling shadow of slavery. From Elmina's dungeons, you descend into dark chambers where captives are kept before being shipped across the ocean. The air is damp, the walls scarred. Voices echo faintly, cries, prayers, silence. You feel the weight of this moment, when Africa's contact with Europe turns decisively toward exploitation. What began with cautious exchanges of mirrors and beads has hardened into chains. Still, the forts are not simply instruments of domination. They are also theaters of negotiation. African rulers demand tribute, control access to resources, and sometimes besiege the forts themselves. You watch as Portuguese captains, despite their stone walls, bow respectfully before local kings, offering gifts to secure peace. The forts may project permanence, but they are fragile islands in a sea of African power. Quirky stories reveal this fragility. In one account, a Portuguese commander locked himself inside Elmina for weeks because local traders refused to bring gold, leaving his soldiers to eat rats until new supplies arrived. Another tale tells of African rulers refusing Portuguese goods until they sent for better textiles from India, showing that Europe did not dictate terms so easily. As you leave the coast at sunset, the forts stand silhouetted against the glowing sky, their cannons jutting outward, their walls gleaming. They are symbols of both presence and vulnerability, ambition and dependence. Africa and Europe are now bound by stone and trade, by marriage and chains, by prayers and betrayals, and as the waves lap against the shore, you sense that these forts are more than just buildings. They are the beginning of something irreversible, a European footprint planted firmly on African soil, a footprint that will widen into pathways, roads, and empires. For now, though, they remain fragile beacons on a vast and mysterious coast, their lights flickering against the darkness of the sea. You drift into the early dawn of the 16th century, the shoreline of Africa glowing faintly as the sun rises over surf and stone. The caravels are fewer now in your imagination, replaced by galleons with taller masts and deeper holds. their sails patched and seasoned by countless voyages. Europe has not just brushed Africa. It has left its imprint in forts, in maps, in stories, and in the lives of people on both sides of the sea. You feel the hum of continuity as you step quietly through these echoes, watching how the earliest meetings linger like footprints pressed into wet sand. In Elmina, the fort gleams white against the greenery, its walls sturdy and commanding. But around it, markets bustle with African traders who are not subdued but selective, negotiating hard, refusing deals they dislike. You watch a ruler stride into the courtyard, flanked by attendants bearing gifts of ivory tusks and gold dust. The Portuguese captain bows low, offering bolts of Indian cloth and a crucifix bound in silver. The moment is diplomatic theater, equal parts curiosity and caution. Historians still debate how much power shifted in these exchanges, whether the Europeans were truly in control, or whether they remained dependent on African rulers to open doors inland. Further south in Congo, Christian bells toll beside drums. The Manicongo Afonso I writes letters to Lisbon, requesting priests and teachers, seeking to blend European learning with local governance. You picture him sitting in a dimly lit hall, quills scratching across parchment, his words half plea, half demand. A quirky detail slips into one of these letters. He complains that too many Portuguese merchants are flooding his kingdom with cheap goods and enslaving people illegally, disrupting order. The image lingers, an African king scolding a European monarch, reminding you that these encounters were not one-sided, but contested, negotiated, human. In Luanda, Portuguese settlers carve stone streets, while inland kingdoms watch carefully, sometimes cooperating, sometimes resisting. Daily life takes on a hybrid shape. African women walk with European fabrics draped over their shoulders, while Portuguese sailors sip palm wine in local taverns. Children play together in courtyards, their words a mix of Kikongo and Portuguese, their songs blending rhythms of drum and lute. A quirky scene unfolds when a Portuguese soldier, missing the bread of his homeland, tries to bake loaves with cassava flour, producing cakes so dense that his comrades laugh until their sides ache. Small details like this stitch humanity into the larger weave of empire. But shadows lengthen. In Elmina's dungeons, men and women wait in chains, their cries muffled by stone. The slave trade grows from a trickle to a stream. At first, it feels like one trade among many: ivory, pepper, gold, and now human lives. Yet slowly, it begins to dominate, reshaping priorities. Ships once heavy with pepper now carry hundreds of captives. You feel the air in the dungeons, damp and suffocating, and know that Africa's encounter with Europe is forever altered. Still, you see resilience. Along the Swahili coast, cities like Kilwa and Mombasa continue their trade with Arabia and India, sometimes pushing back against Portuguese incursions, sometimes bending, sometimes resisting with fierce determination. Local rulers weigh alliances, sometimes using Portuguese firearms to defeat rivals, sometimes turning those same weapons against Europeans. Historians argue endlessly. Was Africa overwhelmed from the start? Or did it engage in centuries of negotiation, adaptation, and resistance? The answer, you sense, is both. And then there are the echoes that drift into European imagination. In Florence, a painter sketches elephants and exotic shells, his mind ablaze with reports from Africa. In Seville, merchants sip wine and speak of African gold mines as if they are fountains of endless wealth. In Antwerp, children point at maps where Africa is drawn with strange beasts prowling its margins. A quirky anecdote circulates. A European scholar insists that in Africa there live people with feet so large they can shade themselves like umbrellas. Even as ships bring back facts, myths cling stubbornly to the edges of maps. Proof that imagination is slow to yield to reality. You step once more into an African marketplace. The air buzzes with trade, laughter, and music. Portuguese traders barter nervously, aware they are guests as much as they are interlopers. You see the subtle shifts of daily life. A crucifix hanging beside a traditional idol in a household. A clay pot filled with European wine, a Portuguese cloak dyed with African indigo. These are not empires etched in marble, but fragile threads woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. As the century turns, you feel the weight of what has been set in motion. Africa is no longer a distant rumor on parchment or a myth whispered in taverns. It is part of Europe's world, not yet conquered, but already entangled. Trade, faith, forts, and forced labor tie the two continents together in bonds both creative and destructive. You sit by the shoreline as night falls, the sea sighing against sand, caravels rocking gently at anchor. The stars above shimmer, the same stars that guided Phoenicians, Romans, Vikings, and now Portuguese. You think of the rose petals Gil Eanes once brought back beyond Cape Bojador, the laughter of children startled by mirrors, the awe of Portuguese sailors at penguins near the Cape, the steady beat of African drums merging with European strings. These moments are fragile, fleeting, yet they echo across centuries. And now, as you drift deeper into thought, the rhythm softens. The forts fade into silhouettes, the drums into whispers, the markets into a hush. The sea becomes a blanket of calm, its tide rocking you gently toward rest. Africa's story with Europe has only begun. But for tonight, you leave it here, on the shore, under the stars, with history's quiet pulse carrying you into sleep. Inhale slowly, exhale gently. Let the echoes of ships and markets fade. Let the voices of rulers and sailors soften into silence. The world is wide, the past is deep, but your night is peaceful. Rest now in the quiet hum of history's embrace.